Our next speaker is presently living in Florida, but he is originally from South Carolina. And so you will have a little bit of a hard time understanding him. He's got an accent, but he lives in South Carolina with his wife, Susanna, and their two children, Leo and Evangeline. And those are his three great accomplishments. But he's also written a few books. He's written 12 or 13 books this month. He wrote a book on G.K. Chesterton in which he claims that Chesterton was a Catholic. He wrote a book on Tolkien in which he claims that Tolkien was a Catholic. Wrote a book on Oscar Wilde, claiming that Oscar Wilde was a Catholic. Wrote a book on Solzhenitsyn, claiming that he was a Russian. And just recently has written a book on William Shakespeare, claiming that he was not Russian. But that he was, I haven't read the book yet. It's one of the only books that I haven't read by Joseph, but I understand the thesis of the book is that Shakespeare was Christopher Marlowe, right? Is that what it is? So it's should be looked at. So I ask you just to please listen very closely to what our next speaker has to say, because if you don't listen closely, you won't understand anything. He is teaching down at Ave Maria University, teaches English. He's the writer in residence there, and he cleverly is only in residence 4 months out of the year. But he has spoken here before. He's been a guest at our Chesterton conference in the Twin Cities, and I'm always happy when I can stumble across his path as I've done it today. Please welcome Joseph Pearce.
I wonder if I can walk around with this. Now that I live in South Carolina, I've got Elvis Presley-itis. As a southern boy, I find it impossible to talk without moving my pelvis a bit, so I'm going to have to move a bit. So if you're embarrassed, just look at me from the waist up, okay? Okay, the partners in paradox, the charm of the Chesterbelloc. And first of all, I'd like to say before I start on that, how great it is to be back here. My wife knows that when I get invited to Chesterton events, that I'm like a sort of a child that lives in a cookie jar, you know. And she likes me going in. She knows I don't go to bed early enough. She knows I come back home exhausted, and I'm not much fun for 12 hours or so when I actually wake up. But she knows how much I enjoy it. So the Chesterton conference in St. Paul, or wherever it's going to be in the future, is one that she wants me to go to. And this one in Rochester, which has now become something of a tradition, this is my 4th time here, is another one she wants me to go to because she knows that it's a bit like a mini vacation for me. So thank you for allowing me to go on a holiday with you. Now, I owe a great debt to the Chesterbelloc, to Chesterton and Belloc, and some of those books that Dale mentioned, say one was on Chesterton, the other was on Belloc, and both of those books were acts of thanksgiving on my part because of so much that I owe to them. And last year, those of you that were here know that I gave my conversion story. You would have remembered the great part that Chesterton and Belloc played in bringing me to Christ. So there was that act of thanksgiving both to Chesterton and Belloc and to God for giving me Chesterton and Belloc and I hope that my books will succeed in giving Chesterton and Belloc to other people. So, obviously, it's always an honour to speak on these great people. Also, Ronald Knox said that Chesterton's paradoxes had become the platitudes of his thoughts. And that's largely true of me as well. And I spent the last 15 years trying to not sound like a pastiche of Chesterton every time I write anything. Chesterton taught me how to think, taught me how to discuss, taught me how to argue, and in many ways taught me how to write. So I find myself writing in a Chestertonian style. And that's great, but I don't just want to sound like a poor man's Chesterton. So I'm trying to unlearn that aspect of Chesterton's influence. But it's a great blessing that he even brought me there. So let's talk about the Chesterbelloc. Now the name was coined by George Bernard Shaw, basically saying that G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc were seen so synonymously in the things they stood for and the things they said that they made two halves of an amusing pantomime piece. Now those of you, the British have exported all sorts of high culture to the United States, but pantomime, alas, is not one of them. But if you go to England, particularly during Christmas season, they have pantomimes everywhere. It's low part. It was fun. Now got all sorts of horrible things being done to it, as is everything else. But a pantomime horse, for those of you that don't know, is that one person stands at the front here with a horse's head on, the other person behind like this with a tail, and they walk around together like that, making a horse rather than using horse. And so what Shaw said was that Chesterton and Belloc were like a rather amusing pantomime elephant. George Bernard Shaw could forgive Chesterton and Belloc their Catholicism, their distributism, but he couldn't forgive them the fact they were fat. Some of you may know Shaw was something of a fitness fanatic and a vegetarian to boot. So that's where the name of Chesterbelloc came from. And H.G. Wells, the other sort of giant literary figure that Chesterton and Belloc were often fighting with, claimed that Chesterton and Belloc had succeeded in giving Catholicism a boozy halo. A halo for good fun. Joie de vivre, rambunctiousness. And again, for me, on my path, that was good. And the fact that you have the faith and the fun, because I think we also subconsciously have this puritanical view that to get faith, we should live up to all the things you enjoy. And in fact, when I got the faith, I started to realise there were loads of things I could enjoy that I hadn't realised. So, this is also, of course, the theme of this conference is about paradox. And one of the great paradoxes, of course, is marriage, when two become one. Now, I'm not going to say that G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc were married, although in the United States now they could be. But you can say that in this mystical figure of the Chesterbelloc that Shaw invented, the two had become one flesh. And in some ways it can be said that the one is larger than the two. The Chesterbelloc, in this sort of mystery, has become a figure that's almost legendary as a fighting force. It's a figure that's a prophet, it's a figure that's dynamic, it's a figure that's orthodox. In fact, the Chesterbelloc could be called a prophet of dynamic orthodoxy. But it's also, while on the subject of paradoxes, Chesterbelloc reminds me something of a dragon. Except being a Chestertonian dragon, or Chesterbellocian dragon, I probably should say. It's not a dragon for which the damsel in distress should be worried. It's a dragon that's there to defend the damsel in distress. It's a giant beast that champions the small. The poor against the rich, the family against the state, the family against state family planning, small business against big business, small government against big government, small nations against big nations, little England against Great Britain. And certainly the last of those, all of those things are very important in my development, in my coming to Christ, but the whole notion of just be happy to be a little Englander rather than glorying in Great Britain and the Empire and everything else was something I learned from Chesterton and Belloc and very grateful for. And of course, a lot of this philosophy of the Chesterbelloc is what the Catholic Church calls subsidiarity. And if you look in your Catechism of the Catholic Church and look up subsidiarity in the index, you'll get a very short definition of what it is. But Belloc, who was the leader of the two of them in distributism, Chesterton himself said that he was the prophet and Chesterton was the disciple. But Belloc was hugely influenced by Pope Leo XIII's encyclical of 1891, Rerum Novarum, so the first great Catholic social encyclical, and also by the teaching of Cardinal Manning, who Belloc knew. So we need to realise the distributism and the philosophy and the things that the Chesterbelloc championed are very much in harmony with the social teaching of the Catholic Church. And the other paradox, of course, is that this whole subsidiarity thing was summarised by E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful. And most people don't know that Schumacher himself was hugely influenced by the Catholic encyclicals in the writing of that book, and he became a Catholic a year before that book was published. Small is beautiful, but the paradox is also that small is bigger than big, in the sense that virtue, if we're talking about virtue, then small is bigger than big because it has more of it. Humility is bigger than pride. So this notion of paradox being an apparent contradiction, when used by Chesterton, is always an apparent contradiction that points to a deeper truth. And this part of paradox, again, was very important on my own conversion, to start thinking paradoxes, to start thinking paradoxes. And the most important lessons we can learn, the most important truths that we can learn, are paradoxes. It takes a big man to know how small he is. Or pride is the mask of a small man who thinks he's big. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Or the big God who becomes a little baby. Or the title of my book on Chesterton, Wisdom and Innocence. Because I was always taught in my secular agnostic upbringing that innocence was the opposite of wisdom. That through the Father Brown stories, the innocence of Father Brown, and the wisdom of Father Brown, it's clear that Father Brown's wisdom resides in his innocence. And in fact, he wouldn't have the wisdom unless he retained his innocence. And the connection between things such as gratitude and humility. Oscar Wilde once said that people don't appreciate sunsets because they can't pay for them. To which Chesterton responded that Oscar Wilde could pay for sunsets by not being Oscar Wilde. Gratitude and humility are what's necessary. And the other thing with Chesterton and Belloc is the combination not just of gratitude and humility, but humour and humility. And certainly in Chesterton's case, he was very happy to have great mirth on the nature of his girth. He was obviously a very big man. Lord Belloc was always chastising him for being so big. And during the First World War, there's a story that Chesterton was on an omnibus in London, and this woman came up to him and chastised him for being a coward, and saying, "Sir, why are you not out at the front?" And Chesterton said, "Madam, going out to my side, you'll see that I am." Now, that's funny. But it's also a very good charitable riposte. Because you look at the size of Chesterton was, and obviously he had also near ill health. He was about to have his major collapse in health that almost threatened his life. There's no way that Chesterton could have fought in the First World War. In fact, I can't help having this sort of absurd vision of Chesterton being winched into the trenches. And then when the officers blow the whistle to go over the top, they say, well, hang on a second, just got to get the winch out again. And bearing in mind, how few people recover going over the top, that Chesterton is such a big target, his chance of survival is minimal. But there's another story about when Chesterton was over here in the United States. And he was struggling to get into a taxi. And the taxi driver was trying to help him get into this taxi. And the taxi driver says, "Sir, you might find it easier if you go in sideways." And Chesterton said, "I have no sideways." Now, I said, although the Chesterbelloc are mystically one in this case of ashore, they're certainly, although they're one, they are not the same. There are many, many differences between them. And one of them would be the humour. Belloc had a great sense of humour, but not this sort of self-effacing, humble humour we see in Chesterton. But what both of them were men of letters. And we live in an age that's mainly artful about specialisation. And the trouble with that, of course, is that we have been channeled into pigeonholes, we've compartmentalised ourselves, and in so doing, we become experts. We become expert about one thing and ignorant about everything else. We don't have a Catholic understanding of the small c. We don't see the panorama, we just see the one thing we're fixated on. But more than that, this specialisation, this expertise, actually stops us from being experts in our own specialisation. I mean, the whole concept, the whole notion of liberal arts education, that Hilaire, for instance, we have, is you can't read literature if you don't also understand philosophy, theology, and history. You pick up a work of literature and you have no idea about the philosophy and the theology and the historical context, you're not going to understand that work of literature. It doesn't matter how much you specialise in. So now you have people that are literature PhDs that have no notion of theology, no notion of philosophy, and very little notion of history. Well, really what they learn is to be a sophist, to use language to make themselves sound clever, to make other people think they sound clever, they're talking about a text. But very often, what they're saying has little or no connection with the text itself, objectively speaking. So, Chesterton and Belloc were not specialists. They were not, in inverted commas, experts. They dabbled in all sorts of things. You name it, in the literary sense, they did it. So they were novelists, poets, historians, biographers, essayists, artists. Both of them were artists. So let's go through some of those to see how they are different. As a novelist, I would have to say that Chesterton is superior to Belloc, largely because Belloc would certainly agree, Chesterton wouldn't. But Chesterton says in his autobiography that he managed to spoil quite a few good ideas by trying to turn them into novels. But really, the Man Alive, The Ball and the Cross, The Man Who's Thursday, The Napoleon of Notting Hill, Flying In, these are wonderful, rambunctious adventures. And just to be with Chesterton, to be in the presence of this genius, having such fun with these ideas, is absolutely a joy. Well, the name of Chesterbelloc, in the literary sense, actually refers to Belloc's novels that were illustrated by Chesterton. They became known as the Chesterbellocs. And Belloc believed that Chesterton's illustrations were the best things about the novel. To a degree, I agree with him. So I think as a novelist, Chesterton certainly is superior. Although I would make a couple of reservations about that. First of all, Belloc wrote a late novel, which if you haven't read, I really do urge you to do so, called Belinda. And this novel really has such finesse, such a lightness of touch. It's like a playful, ironic pastiche on the Jane Austen type romance novel. And it's just delightful, and so well written, and so easy to read. Very different with early novels, it's very ponderous, it chugs along slowly. This is very agile, the paradox it is when he was an old man. And it was also the one novel he himself was happy with. And very few people read it. And the other thing I would say is that he invented a genre, which I think in many respects is one of the most delightful things that he did. What I call peripatetic farragos, and that's difficult to say after a few glasses of wine. Peripatetic farragos, see, I made a mistake with that, a few glasses of wine. Peripatetic farragos, such as Part of the Road, The Four Men, The Cruise of the Nona. These are delightful works where basically the characters in it come alive in discussions on a journey. So whether it's on a journey to Rome, on a journey across Sussex, or on a cruise around the English coastline. And these are delightful books. I'm certainly recommending you to look those up. As poets, I will say controversially that I think Belloc is the better poet. I can almost see the steam coming out of Dale's ears as I speak.
If you look closer, you can see it without the open.
I mean, again, I have few reservations because, Chesterton wrote some wonderful poems, Ballad of the White Horse, Lepanto, and quite a few others. But if you actually look at the volume of Chesterton's poetry, although there's some very good poems, there are many others that aren't particularly good. And that's because he scribbled them down, he jotted them, he wrote them in 5 minutes. And I think this might be what Buchanan was trying to get at, the slave over them. But I would say that some of John Keats's finest sonnets apparently were written in less than half an hour. So you have a gift. Yeah. But for me, Belloc's poetry, such as Twelfth Night, is like Christian Yeats. It has that haunting mysticism, the orthodoxy with it. It's the faith and fairyland combined. It's wonderful. And Tarantella and Hannah Camille, these glorious poems. And for me, as a racist, whatever I was, one of the slogans of the Nazi Party, which had a lot of attraction to me when I was younger and stupid, was blood and soil. The things that make us what we are is our blood, our race, and our soil, our nation, our homeland, our fatherland. But what Belloc and Chesterton, but Belloc in books like The Four Men and The Path of Rome, and these poems, maybe what poem about Sussex, taught me the intrinsic theology of place. I think Belloc is very good on theology of place, on the meaning of home and the meaning of exile. And of course, the Salve Regina, after this our exile, we're all in exile. We all long for home, and we all find surrogate homes here with our families, where we come from or where we settle. It's never quite a real thing. This sense of exile, this sense of melancholy, this theology of place, Belloc has about Sussex and about France, and in these poems and these books, that taught me much more important than blood and soil was soul and soil. Home and exile and our destiny. I owe a great deal to Belloc and Chesterton for that. Now, as artists, we don't often think about Belloc and Chesterton as artists, but I think we get a great insight into their different approach to literature and the way they work with literature differ from just looking at them as artists. Because Chesterton, again, was a brilliant artist and a caricaturist, and his art he produced again quickly and they are works of genius. Belloc's art is seen mostly in the illustrations to books like The Path to Rome, his sketchbook, when he was travelling, and he's much more meticulous in his sense of detail. One can imagine he took a bit longer with these things. And I think we see that in Chesterton, as I said, in a work of literature like Twice Have You Visited, there's not a single redundant passage, a single redundant line, it's not even a comma or a period that's not exactly where it should be. Formally, it's as near as we can get to perfection. Chesterton wrote his novels like he did his art, quickly and at pace. And I think when you actually try to look at Chesterton's novels with that probing, close-reading style, you kill it. Because what you're doing when you're reading Chesterton, any Chesterton on any subject, but particularly in his novels, is you have the exhilaration of the presence of genius. And the exhilaration of the presence of genius having fun with great ideas and the biggest ideas. You just go along for the ride, it's a roller coaster. Get breathless. Get excited. But don't take out the scalpel and the microscope and start looking at the form of the work because you'll kill it. They were both historians, of course. Belloc got a first-class honours degree in history from Oxford University. And it would be fair to say that a lot of Chesterton's conception of history, particularly the wider European history, was influenced by Belloc. They were both biographers. Of course, we read about Chesterton's book on Thomas Aquinas, Francis of Assisi, Dickens, Louis Stevenson, Watts, etc. And of course, Belloc also was a biographer, though in his case, historical figures. And I could say much more about the importance of Belloc as a historian, but I have to cut myself short. And the other thing about both of them, of course, is as essayists. And again, their style as essayists is similar to this metaphor I gave you about their art. Chesterton reminds me of a fencer, someone who is fencing with his adversary. He's quick on his feet, it's paradox. You know, he's a big man, you can't really imagine him running a marathon. But when he's writing, he's so agile, so quick. The sleight of hand, quick movement, the wit, the wisdom. You really feel exhilarated being in the presence of this man jousting or fencing with his foes. And we see this, I think, particularly in the role of both of these men as defenders of the Catholic faith. In Orthodoxy and in The Everlasting Man and in many of Chesterton's other works of Catholic apologetics, we see this fencer, we see this man who's agile, who's almost a buccaneer fighting for the truth. Whereas look at Belloc's books, and you look at, for instance, Survivals and New Arrivals, which is a wonderful book in the Great Heresies. Survivals and New Arrivals is about the great heresies of history. The survivals that are the heresies that have survived, and the new arrivals are the new heresies. But the way that he tackles these same things that Chesterton tackles is to trundle Chesterton's the as I said, the knight in shining armour, the fencer, the musketeer, the cavalier. Belloc trundles over the horizon in a tank. But he doesn't fire the tank, he won't get any explosions, he just trundles through the tank, crushing everything in his way. And that's not quite so entertaining to watch or to read, but it's as devastating as a critique of the things he's critiquing. So I would recommend, obviously I cannot recommend forever the Everlasting Man of Orthodoxy, but don't overlook Belloc, the Great Heresies, Survivals and New Arrivals. And then we have the disputes, the fights that Chesterbelloc had with their contemporaries, and the best known one, of course, is H.G. Wells and the Chesterbelloc. As I'm sure many of you know, H.G. Wells wrote a history called The Outline of History. And it was a typical progressive view of history. In other words, humanity is progressive. We're getting smarter and wiser, and in the future we will eventually shake off the last remnants of superstition and religion and move forward into a golden age. Because that's the way that humanity is ascending from the cave and the primeval soup to this golden, wonderful destiny. Now, Belloc, when he read the outline history by Wells, was incensed. I've likened it, I think in my biography of Belloc as showing a red rat to a bull, and Belloc predictably charged. And Belloc wrote a book called A Companion to H.G. Wells' Outline History. In which he basically, like the tank I mentioned, over the lives, just demolishing one arm of the world after another. And Wells wrote a response. He wrote a book called Mr. Belloc Objects. And as you know, Hilaire Belloc was a bruiser, he was a pugilist. Chesterton was a fencer, Belloc was a heavyweight boxer, and he was certainly going to have the last word. So when H.G. Wells put out his book, Mr. Belloc Objects, Belloc wrote a book called Mr. Belloc Still Objects. And Belloc claims to have written over 100,000 words in refutation of Wells' outline history. And we see a difference between the two halves of Chesterbelloc in their reaction to that. Because Chesterton wrote The Everlasting Man as a response to H.G. Wells' outline history. But whereas Belloc had gone for the jugular, and really gone for the kill, with, say, Bellocian bellicosity, Chesterton addressed Wells's main thesis with Chestertonian charity, not Bellocian bellicosity. So he doesn't mention, Wells's book particularly. That's not what it's about. But what he really says is that humanity is not progressing to some golden age in the future. The humanity basically is unchanging. Humanity itself is unchanging. And that the whole of history points towards the incarnation. That the history before the incarnation points forward to it, the history since the incarnation points back to it. It's the centre of history. One of my favourite parts of the book is at the beginning, because the second half of the book begins with the God in the cave. So again, the paradox there, the God in the cave, the God in the manger. So at the beginning of the book, there's the man in the cave. When he takes on this thing about the caveman. And what he says is that we have presumed, like H.G. Wells and those who believe in human progress, that our ancestors in the caves were primitive, barbaric, that they basically dragged their women around by their hair. If the women didn't do what they were told, they hit them over the head with a club. And if they survived that experience and still didn't behave themselves, our ancestors probably ate their wives. This sort of idea of the caveman, some sort of savage. And the Chesterton said, well, where's the evidence? So when we look in caves, do we find huge piles of eaten wives? He said, no. When we look in caves, we find art. We find art on the walls. And art is the one thing that separates humanity from the rest of the animals. Art is something expressing the image of God in us, the imagination, creativity, God the creator, man the sub-creator. So the only evidence we have about our ancestors is they were pretty much like us. And Chesterton, who was an art student, of course, and a very good artist, not only do you say that we find art on the walls, we find extremely good art on the walls. Okay, so to finish up with H.G. Wells, looking back on H.G. Wells, he was very much an up-to-date person in his day with the new latest ideas. We see that his science fiction today, 100 years after it was written, is intriguing, but perhaps somewhat silly, and certainly somewhat dated. The paradox is that H.G. Wells' future is passé. And the last book that Wells wrote was called The Mind at the End of Its Tether. Because he had this faith in this progressive humanity, this golden age in the future, and he lived long enough to witness the rise of Nazism, Second World War, the dropping of bombs, the dropping of atom bombs, and this was the progress. The mind at the end of its tether. That's where progressive man, that's where H.G. Wells ended up. Now, I want to look at Chesterton at his best now. Talk about Chesterton as a fencer. Now, there was a book that was written by someone called Holbrook Jackson. It's called Platitudes in the Making. And Jackson was sort of influenced by the decadence and by Shaw, and certainly was influenced by the, should we say, skeptical, relativistic zeitgeist. And Chesterton got hold of a copy of this book and wrote, besides Jackson's platitudes, his own response. And by some miracle, this book was discovered in a bookstore in San Francisco. Chesterton was writing in it, and was subsequently published by Nature's Press, as Platitudes Undone. But I want to just give you a bit of Chesterton's wit now. I'm going to use a hat. Microphone, a hat, and most of it. I'm also going to be a juggler. So when I put the hat on and face this way, I'll be Chesterton. When I face that way without the hat, I'll be Holbrook Jackson. See some of Chesterton's genius and wit here. Long way round. Be contented when you have got all you want. Till then, be happy. Don't think, do. Do think, do. A lie is that which you do not believe. This is a lie, so perhaps you don't believe it. As soon as an idea is accepted, it is time to reject it. No, it is time to build another idea on it. You are always rejecting and you build nothing. Truth and falsehood in the abstract do not exist. And there's nothing else. Truth is one's own conception of things. The big blunder. All thought is an attempt to discover if one's own conception is true or not. No two men have exactly the same religion. A church, like society, is a compromise. The same religion has the two men. The sun shines on the evil and the good, but the sun does not compromise. This one, I think, might be my favourite. Only the rich preach content to the poor. When they're not preaching socialism. In a beautiful city, an art gallery would be superfluous. In an ugly one, it is a narcotic. In a real one, it is an art gallery. Negations without affirmations are worthless and impossible. Theology and religion are not the same thing. When the churches are controlled by the theologians, religious people stay away. Theology is simply that part of religion that requires brains. Desire to please God is never disinterested. Well, I should hope not. We are more inclined to regret our virtues than our vices, but only the very honest will admit this. I don't regret any virtues except those I have lost. Every custom was once an eccentricity. Every idea was once an absurdity. No, no, no. Some ideas are always absurdities. This is one of them. No opinion matters finally except your own. Said the man who thought he was a rabbit. I think there, if we want to look at the charm of the Chesterbelloc, or certainly the charm of the Chesterton, we see it in abundance. Great reason, told with great fun. We look at George Bernard Shaw, one of the great adversaries of the Chesterbelloc, the one that gave the Chesterbelloc his name. His Nietzscheanism and his socialism during his own time were avant-garde. George Bernard Shaw was a prophet. Nietzscheanism, of course, deteriorated into Nazism. Socialism deteriorated into Hilaire archipelago, to mass murder. So much so that Shaw's avant-garde has now become rearguard and discredited. And there's a book someone needs to write about Shaw's progress, because I haven't studied this very much. It seems to me that George Bernard Shaw ended much closer to the position of the Chesterbelloc than he ever was when he was younger, as if he was moving in the right direction. But that's something someone else needs to write. Chesterton said that the Catholic faith saves one from the degradation of being a slave of one's time. C.S. Lewis, who of course was greatly influenced by Chesterton in his own conversion to Christianity, said fashions are always coming and going, but mostly go. Fashions fade and die, as do their dedicated followers. That's an allusion to a song by the Kings, by the way, those in the 1960s. Fashions fade and die, as do their dedicated followers. The faith remains. And there's a few lines of Belloc I like, I want to read as well. So the faith remains. He does not die, he can bequeath some influence on the land he knows, or dares persistent interweave, love permanent with the wild hedgerows. He rises loud October skies, he does not die, he does not die. Chesterton and Belloc were poets of the permanent things, and as such, their permanence is assured. So much for those who do not die, Chesterton and Belloc. What of those who have not learned how to live? What about the culture of death? The Catholic convert poet Roy Campbell referred to the fear of death and the fear of growing old in our materialistic culture as the Peter Panic. It's a permanent adolescence. The people basically grow up from being a child to being pubescent. And after that, in our culture, they are told not to go any further, to behave like pubescent adolescents. What we need to restore in our culture is that the purpose of growing old is to grow up. And there's a paradox at the heart of that we have to cease being childish by remaining childlike. We have to attain wisdom through innocence. Or, as the rock group U2 say, if you want to kiss the sky, you have to learn how to kneel. The charm of Chesterbelloc, for me, personally speaking, the but that it taught me how to kneel. And having gained humility, one discovers gratitude. When one discovers gratitude, one wants to know who to thank. And that's when one discovers God. I want to finish with Belloc and Chesterton on each other. As I'm sure many of you know, Chesterton devoted a chapter of his autobiography, entitled Portrait to a Friend, in a tribute to Hilaire Belloc. Following Chesterton's death, Belloc wrote a book called On the Place of Gilbert Keith Chesterton in English Letters. And one of the things that Belloc said in that was that the future of Chesterton will depend upon the future of the faith. In other words, as long as England, as long as Western civilization doesn't lose the faith, Chesterton's place will be assured. And I want to actually give the last words to Hilaire Belloc himself, because although I agree and believe that Chestertonian charity is better than Bellocian bellicosity, Bellocian bellicosity can be great fun. And this is, just to finish with, Hilaire Belloc's lines to adorn who dares attack his Chesterton. Belloc defended Chesterton, the best way to end a speech on the child of Chesterbelloc. Remote and ineffectual dawn that dared attack my Chesterton. With that poor weapon half impelled, unlearnt, unsteady, hardly held, unworthy for a tilt with men, your quavering and corroded pen. Dawn poor at bed and worse at table, dawn pinched, dawn starved, dawn miserable, dawn stuttering, dawn with roving eyes, dawn nervous, dawn approved dawn clerical, dawn ordinary, dawn self-absorbed and solitary, dawn here and there, dawn epileptic, dawn puffed and empty, dawn dyspeptic, dawn dull, dawn brutish, dawn pedantic, dawn hypocritical, dawn bad, dawn furtive, dawn three-quarters mad, dawn since a man must make an end, dawn that shall never be my friend. Dawn different from these regal dawns, with hearts of gold and lungs of bronze, who shout the bang and roar and bawl, the absolute across the hall, or sail in amply bellowing gown, enormous through the sacred town, bearing from college to their homes deep cargoes of gigantic tomes. Dawns admirable, dawns of might, uprising on my inward sight, compact of ancient tales and port and sleep, and learning of sort. Dawns English, worthy of the land, dawns rooted, dawns that understand. Good dawns perpetual that remain, a landmark, walling in the plain, the horizon of my memories, like large and comfortable trees. Dawn very much apart from these. Thou scapegoat dawn, thou dawn devoted, dawn to thine own damnation quoted, perplexed to find thy trivial name, reading my verse to lasting shame. Dawn dreadful, grasping dawn at wearing, impulsive dawn, dawn parcel bearing, dawn of the cold and doubtful breath, dawn despicable, dawn of death. Dawn nasty, skimpy, silent level, dawn evil, dawn that serves the devil, dawn ugly, that makes 50 lines. There is a canon which confines a rhyme of the syllabic Pearce, if written in iambic verse, to 50 lines. I never cut, how far I pretend to end it, but, believe me, I shall soon return. My fires are banked, but still they burn, to write some more about the dawn that dares attack my Chesterton. Thank you.